The county tax auction was almost over, with only one property left on the list, and most people had already begun gathering their belongings because nobody expected the final tract to attract a single bid. The 184 acres, buried beneath nearly 2 decades of relentless kudzu, had become so notorious that locals no longer called it by its original name, referring to it simply as the Kudzu Place, a farm that had defeated every owner who had tried to reclaim it, and swallowed everything from fence lines and pastures to abandoned buildings and towering hardwood trees beneath an endless blanket of green. When the auctioneer called for an opening bid, the room fell silent as farmers exchanged knowing smiles, convinced the property would remain unsold once again. Then, without saying a word, a 35-year-old woman named Claire Donovan quietly raised her paddle and agreed to pay $140,000 for land that almost everyone believed was beyond saving. As she signed the paperwork, one farmer leaned toward another and muttered with a laugh, "She just bought herself 184 acres of weeds," while a few others simply shook their heads, convinced they had just watched someone throw away a fortune on land that even experienced farmers had long ago given up trying to save. 3 months later, the laughter spread even further when Claire returned to the property, not with bulldozers or excavators as everyone had expected, but with 68 boar goats. People began driving past the farm just to watch what they believed would become one of the county's most expensive mistakes, while others confidently predicted she'd be bankrupt before the first winter, because nobody could imagine a herd of goats succeeding where years of heavy machinery, determined owners, and enormous restoration costs had already failed. At first, it seemed as though they were right, but neither the county nor Claire realized those goats were about to uncover something that had been buried beneath the vines for decades, a discovery that would transform the most abandoned property in North Georgia into one of its most respected pecan orchards. Before we continue, if you're new to The Last Acre, welcome. This channel is dedicated to remarkable rural stories that time almost forgot. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, consider subscribing. Now, let's go back to the day Claire Donovan decided to bet everything on land that everyone else had already abandoned. Claire Donovan never planned to buy the most abandoned farm in the county. In fact, when she first began looking for land in North Georgia, she wasn't searching for a fixer-upper or a forgotten property at all. Like hundreds of other first-time buyers, she simply wanted a modest piece of farmland where she could eventually build a quieter life away from Atlanta, but after months of searching, every promising property seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it appeared. The farms that needed little work sold within days, while the ones that remained on the market usually carried problems so expensive that few people wanted to touch them. After another disappointing weekend of visiting properties, Claire stopped at a small real estate office to ask whether anything else might be coming onto the market soon. The agent apologized and admitted that demand had become so strong that finding reasonably priced farmland was becoming harder every year. Then, almost as an afterthought, he smiled and said, "Well, unless you're interested in the Kudzu Place." Claire looked up. "The what?" "The Kudzu Place," he repeated. "Nobody calls it by its real name anymore." That single sentence immediately caught her attention. Every farm had a story, but very few earned a nickname that everyone in the county seemed to recognize. When she asked what made the property so different, the agent leaned back in his chair before explaining that the farm had once been productive, but had slowly disappeared beneath nearly 2 decades of unchecked kudzu. 3 different owners had tried to reclaim it, each believing they had a better plan than the last. Yet every one of them eventually walked away after discovering that clearing the vines would cost far more than the land itself seemed worth. Most buyers lost interest the moment they heard that story. Claire became more interested. 2 days later, she drove to see the property for herself. The moment she stepped through the rusted entrance gate, she understood why people had stopped calling it a farm. Kudzu covered nearly everything within sight. Fence posts leaned beneath the weight of thick vines. Abandoned equipment had almost vanished into the greenery, and even the outlines of old buildings were difficult to recognize. It didn't look like land waiting to be farmed. It looked like nature had already decided the place belonged to itself. As Claire stood quietly studying the property, an older farmer pulling a livestock trailer slowed his truck beside the entrance and introduced himself as Earl Whitmore, explaining that he'd farmed the neighboring land for more than 40 years. After asking what had brought her there, He glanced toward the sea of vines before letting out a quiet laugh. "You're not thinking about buying this place, are you?" Claire admitted she was considering it. Earl nodded slowly, as though he'd heard those words before. "I've watched 3 owners stand exactly where you're standing," he said. Every one of them believed they'd be the one to beat those vines. Every one of them eventually left. He wasn't trying to scare her away. He was simply telling her what the land had already taught everyone else. Claire thanked him for his honesty and continued walking, but one thought stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. Everyone she had spoken to saw the property as a warning. Nobody, not the real estate agent, not Earl, not the county, and certainly not the previous owners, could explain what the land might become if someone approached the problem differently. By the time she drove back toward Atlanta that evening, Claire still hadn't decided whether she would bid at the auction. But she knew one thing. She couldn't stop thinking about the Kudzu place. The county auction lasted less than 5 minutes because no one challenged Claire's bid. When the paperwork was finished, several farmers quietly walked past her without saying much, while others offered polite smiles that carried more sympathy than congratulations. To them, buying the Kudzu place wasn't a victory. It was simply becoming the next person willing to lose money on land everyone else had already given up trying to save. Claire understood why they felt that way after spending her first week exploring the property. Every direction she walked ended with another wall of vines. Fence lines disappeared beneath tangled vegetation. Old gates hung crooked beneath layers of growth, and sections that had once been open pasture had become so heavily covered that it was almost impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. The longer she explored, the more one question kept returning to her mind. If 3 different owners had already spent years trying to reclaim this farm, why had every one of them failed? The answer slowly revealed itself as she found the evidence they had left behind. Rusted sections of heavy chain lay half-buried beneath the vines. Broken steel cables remained wrapped around old tree stumps, while deep ruts cut through parts of the property where bulldozers had once struggled across the hillsides. Claire didn't need to meet the previous owners to understand what they had tried to do. They had all declared war on the entire farm from the very beginning, spending enormous amounts of money attacking 184 acres at once before nature quietly reclaimed everything they had managed to clear. That realization changed the question Claire was asking. Instead of wondering how she could remove every vine on the property, she began asking herself whether she needed to fight the whole farm at all. If the previous owners had failed by thinking too big, perhaps the only chance of succeeding was to think much smaller. Almost everyone she spoke with disagreed. Contractors recommended larger machines. Neighbors suggested hiring bulldozers before the vines became even thicker. One equipment dealer confidently explained how many weeks it would take to clear the land if she rented enough machinery. Claire listened carefully to every suggestion because she knew they all came from experience, but every estimate ended the same way, with a bill so large that she would spend most of her savings before planting a single tree or raising a single animal. She left those conversations without an answer until one afternoon. While driving home from visiting another property, she noticed a small herd of goats working their way through an overgrown hillside beside the road. Curious, she pulled over and watched for nearly half an hour as the animals stripped leaves and young vines from brush that looked almost impossible to walk through. The owner explained that the goats would return to the same section repeatedly, weakening unwanted growth over time instead of trying to destroy everything in a single day. Claire drove home thinking less about the goats themselves than about the strategy behind them. The animals weren't trying to conquer the entire hillside. They simply focused on one manageable section before moving to the next, and by the end of the conversation, she realized that was exactly the opposite of what every previous owner had attempted on the Kudzu place. Over the following weeks, she studied managed grazing, spoke with livestock producers who used goats for brush control, and filled page after page of notebooks comparing costs with the price of renting heavy equipment. The numbers surprised her. A herd of goats would require patience, fencing, and daily management, but unlike bulldozers, they would continue working long after the first section had been cleared. More importantly, they would become part of the farm instead of simply another expense. 3 months after the auction, a livestock trailer turned through the rusted entrance carrying 68 boar goats. The news spread through the county almost immediately, and before sunset several trucks had already slowed along the roadside as curious neighbors watched the animals disappear into the first fenced section. Some laughed because they believed Claire had finally accepted defeat and replaced serious farming with wishful thinking, while others simply shook their heads, convinced the goats would accomplish little more than feeding themselves before the vines swallowed everything again. Claire ignored the comments because she wasn't measuring success the way everyone else was. She wasn't trying to reclaim 184 acres before winter. She only wanted the goats to reclaim the first acre well enough to prove that the land could still fight back if someone finally stopped demanding that it change all at once. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing looked different to anyone driving past the farm. Then, early one morning, Claire stepped into the first grazing paddock and noticed something that hadn't been visible when the goats arrived. Beneath the thinning blanket of vines, a straight line of weathered stones stretched through the brush before disappearing again beneath another wall of green. It was too straight to be natural, too carefully placed to be an accident, and it suggested that the land was beginning to reveal pieces of a past that nobody had seen in years. Claire knelt beside the stones, brushed away another handful of vines, and realized that whatever the goats had uncovered was only the beginning. The first month passed slowly enough that anyone driving past the Kudzu place would have sworn the experiment had already failed. The hills still looked green from the road, the abandoned barns remained hidden beneath curtains of vines, and the only obvious change was the sound of dozens of goats working somewhere beyond the overgrowth. More than once, Claire noticed passing drivers slowing down just long enough to shake their heads before continuing on, and she understood exactly what they were thinking because, from a distance, it still looked as though the land was winning. Up close, however, the story was changing one paddock at a time. Every few days, the goats stripped another section of leaves from the vines, allowing sunlight to reach ground that hadn't seen it in years. Claire followed behind them, cutting only what the animals couldn't reach and repairing old fencing as forgotten landmarks slowly emerged from beneath the vegetation. Most of what appeared wasn't remarkable. There were rusted posts, broken gates, coils of barbed wire, and pieces of worn-out machinery that had long since become part of the landscape. They were reminders that people had once worked this farm, but they didn't explain why everyone before her had failed to reclaim it. Then the progress stopped. The goats refused to move through one section near the crest of a hill. At first, Claire assumed the portable fencing had been set incorrectly, but after checking every corner of the paddock, she realized something else was keeping the animals away. Thick mats of old vines had collapsed over one another until they formed a tangled wall that even the goats struggled to push through. It was the first time since buying the farm that she had encountered a place where patience alone wasn't enough. For the next several days, Claire worked alongside the herd instead of ahead of it, opening narrow paths through the densest growth with hand tools rather than heavy equipment. The work was slow, exhausting, and often frustrating because every few feet of progress seemed to reveal another layer of vines beneath it. More than once, she found herself wondering whether the neighbors had been right all along. If one small section demanded this much effort, what chance did she really have against another 180 acres? Late one afternoon, as she pulled away another mass of dead vines, the blade of her pruning saw struck stone. She froze. It wasn't unusual to find rocks on North Georgia farmland, but this one didn't feel like part of the hillside. Brushing away the dirt revealed a flat, weathered face with a nearly straight edge. Curious, Claire cleared another foot of vines and found a second stone touching the first, then a third, each sitting at almost exactly the same height. She stopped working and simply stared. Nature rarely arranged anything with that kind of precision. The following morning she returned before sunrise, expecting to discover that she had imagined the pattern, but as the goats continued feeding nearby and more vines came away, the line of stones stretched farther than she had realized. It disappeared beneath another dense patch of growth in one direction and continued downhill in the other, as though it had once marked the boundary of something important. Claire spent the rest of the week following that line instead of expanding the grazing paddocks. Every few yards, another section emerged, always built from the same weathered fieldstone, always disappearing beneath another blanket of vines before reappearing again farther ahead. The longer she followed it, the less it resembled an ordinary boundary wall and the more it felt like it had been built with a purpose she couldn't yet understand. When Earl stopped by that weekend, Claire led him without a word to the newly uncovered stones. He crouched beside them, brushed away loose soil with the palm of his hand, and remained silent far longer than she expected. Finally, he stood up and looked across the hillside. "I've driven past this farm for over 40 years, he said quietly. "I knew there were old fences somewhere under all these vines, but I've never seen this." "You know what it is?" Claire asked. Earl slowly shook his head. "No." It was the first answer Claire hadn't expected. If a man who had lived beside the property for 4 decades couldn't explain what they were looking at, then whatever the goats were uncovering belonged to a part of the farm's history that had disappeared long before either of them arrived. That evening, after Earl drove away, Claire spread the county survey across her kitchen table and traced the line of stones with a pencil. The wall didn't match any modern boundary, pasture, or recorded structure shown on the map. It simply existed, cutting across the hillside before ending in a blank section where no records offered any explanation. For the first time since buying the kudzu place, Claire wasn't thinking about clearing vines anymore. She was trying to solve a mystery. And somewhere beyond the section the goats hadn't reached yet, the rest of the answer was still buried beneath 20 years of green. For nearly 2 weeks, Claire couldn't stop thinking about the stone wall. Every evening she spread county maps across her kitchen table, comparing modern surveys with faded aerial photographs she borrowed from the local library, but every search ended the same way. The wall appeared on none of them, and no record explained why someone had invested so much labor hauling heavy fieldstone halfway up a hillside that no longer appeared to serve any purpose. The unanswered question became even more frustrating because the wall didn't simply end beneath the vines. It continued into the one section of the farm the goats hadn't yet reached, almost daring her to keep following it. Instead of abandoning the slow strategy that had already begun revealing the farm's forgotten history, Claire continued moving the portable fencing a little farther each week, allowing the goats to strip away another layer of vines before she followed behind, removing only the thick stems they couldn't reach. The progress tested her patience, but every newly cleared section reinforced a lesson she had learned during her first months on the property. Force had failed this farm 3 times before, while patience kept uncovering things nobody realized were still there. One cool October morning, the mystery deepened again. As another curtain of vines collapsed under the relentless browsing of the goats, Claire noticed several unusually large trunks standing just beyond the end of the stone wall. At first glance they appeared to be ordinary hardwoods, yet the longer she studied them, the more they seemed strangely out of place. They weren't scattered randomly across the hillside like the surrounding trees. Each trunk stood almost the same distance from the next, their broad crowns spreading with a uniformity that looked far too deliberate to be natural. Rather than assuming she had discovered something important, Claire continued clearing the surrounding area over the next several days, and with every new section the same pattern repeated itself. Another large tree appeared, then another beyond that. By the end of the week she could no longer dismiss the arrangement as coincidence because the trees followed invisible rows that disappeared beneath the remaining vines, suggesting that whoever had once owned the farm had planted them with a purpose. Curiosity eventually led her to collect several green husks lying beneath one of the trees before driving to Earl's farm. He turned one over in his weathered hands, scraped away part of the outer covering with his pocket knife, and frowned instead of smiling. Claire expected an immediate answer, but Earl remained unusually quiet as though he recognized what he was holding without understanding why it was there. "I know this tree," he finally said, "but I don't know why it's growing where you found it." "What do you mean?" Claire asked. "When I was a boy, there were a few old pecan trees around this county, mostly near old farmhouses or along creek bottoms, but nobody ever talked about an orchard on that hillside. If what you're describing is accurate, then something doesn't fit." That answer only deepened the mystery. The following morning, Claire returned to the property with fresh determination and began walking the hillside more carefully than ever before. Instead of searching for vines or old fences, she focused entirely on the spacing between the trunks. The farther she walked, the more obvious the pattern became until she eventually stopped trying to guess and started counting. One mature tree became 5. 5 became 12. 12 became 23. By late afternoon, she had counted 37 living pecan trees, each one old enough to have been planted decades before the farm disappeared beneath the kudzu. The discovery should have felt like the end of the mystery, yet it immediately created another problem. Claire noticed that many of the trees had dead limbs reaching into the sky, while others produced only sparse clusters of nuts after years of neglect. Several had survived against remarkable odds, but surviving wasn't the same as thriving, and it became painfully clear that finding a forgotten orchard was only the beginning. Restoring it would require years of work, careful pruning, replacement planting, and a level of commitment that none of the previous owners had been willing, or perhaps able, to make. As the afternoon sun settled behind the hills, Claire climbed onto a small rise overlooking the cleared section. From there she could see only 37 mature trees, yet beyond them the remaining sea of vines rolled across the rest of the property like a green blanket. Every now and then another broad canopy rose above the vegetation before disappearing again, making it impossible to tell whether the hillside concealed a handful of additional trees or an entire forgotten planting that no living record had ever documented. For the first time since buying the kudzu place, Claire wasn't wondering whether the farm could be saved. She was wondering how large the original dream had been before it disappeared beneath 20 years of neglect, because if the goats had uncovered 37 forgotten pecan trees without clearing even a fraction of the property, there was no telling what else the remaining acres were still hiding, or how much of that forgotten vision she might one day be able to bring back to life. The winter after discovering the forgotten orchard became the busiest season Claire had experienced since buying the kudzu place. While the goats continued clearing fresh sections of overgrowth, she spent nearly every daylight hour pruning neglected pecan trees, removing dead limbs that had carried years of disease, and giving healthy branches enough room to breathe again. Every tree demanded different decisions because no two had survived the years of neglect in quite the same condition, and there were evenings when she drove back to the farmhouse wondering whether she was restoring an orchard or simply delaying the inevitable decline of trees that had already been abandoned for too long. Spring answered part of that question. Tiny green shoots appeared where lifeless branches had been removed only months earlier, and several of the oldest trees produced stronger growth than anyone expected. The improvement wasn't dramatic enough for passing motorists to notice, but Claire noticed it immediately because she had spent the entire winter studying each tree closely enough to recognize every small sign of recovery. For the first time since raising her paddle at the county auction, she believed the forgotten orchard might still have a future. That belief came under pressure before summer arrived. A violent thunderstorm swept across North Georgia one evening, bringing heavy wind that snapped large limbs from several mature pecan trees. Claire walked through the orchard the following morning expecting to find years of progress undone in a single night. And although the damage was painful to see, something unexpected caught her attention. The oldest trees had lost branches, but they were still standing. Their deep root systems had held firm, while younger volunteer trees along the edges of the property had been uprooted completely. The storm reminded her that survival wasn't determined by appearance alone. The strongest things on the farm were often the ones that had already endured the hardest seasons. Rather than discouraging her, the storm changed her plans. Claire began planting carefully selected grafted pecan trees beside the surviving originals, using the older orchard as the foundation for something much larger. The goats continued grazing between newly planted rows, keeping invasive growth under control while reducing the need for constant mechanical clearing, and every season the hillside looked a little less like abandoned land and a little more like a working farm again. 5 years after the county auction, the first meaningful commercial harvest finally arrived. It wasn't enormous by the standards of established orchards, but it was far larger than Claire had dared imagine while standing in chest-high kudzu wondering whether the experiment would fail like every attempt before it. As pickup trucks rolled into the farmyard to collect sacks of freshly harvested pecans, Claire recognized several familiar faces from the auction room. The same people who had quietly predicted she would lose everything now stood beneath the restored trees, asking how she had managed to bring the forgotten orchard back to life. She answered every question honestly because there had never been a secret. The goats hadn't performed a miracle, and neither had she. They had simply refused to quit after the excitement of the first few weeks disappeared. A few days after the harvest ended, Earl drove onto the property carrying a weathered envelope he had discovered while helping his daughter clean boxes from the attic of the old farmhouse where he had grown up. He explained that the papers had belonged to his late father, who had farmed nearby during the years before the kudzu spread across the valley. Inside the envelope rested a faded black and white photograph. Claire held it carefully. The picture showed the same hillside decades earlier. Rows of young pecan trees stretched across the slope where vines had once stood shoulder-high, while a freshly built stone wall marked the upper edge of the orchard exactly where the goats had uncovered it years later. Written across the back, in faded pencil almost erased by time, were just 8 words. "Someday this orchard will cover the whole hillside." Claire looked up from the photograph toward the living orchard spreading across the land before her. For several quiet moments, she didn't say anything because she finally understood what the farm had been trying to tell her from the day she first walked through the rusted entrance gate. She hadn't rescued someone else's dream from the vines. She had finished it. As the years passed, hundreds of healthy pecan trees gradually replaced the empty spaces left by neglect, while the original survivors continued standing among them as living reminders of where the transformation had begun. Children who visited during harvest season filled buckets beneath trees that had once been buried beneath 20 years of kudzu. The same boar goats still wandered peacefully between the rows, keeping new growth under control, and visitors who had never seen the property in its abandoned years found it almost impossible to believe that the thriving orchard around them had once been dismissed as 184 hopeless acres. Looking across the hillside one autumn evening, Claire realized the greatest lesson the farm had taught had very little to do with goats or pecan trees. Most people had looked at the kudzu place and seen only the years of neglect lying in front of them. She had learned to look beyond the vines and imagine what patient work could uncover instead. In the end, the thriving orchard wasn't built in a single season or through one remarkable discovery hidden beneath the brush. It was built because someone chose to keep uncovering one small piece of the future at a time until the dream that another farmer had started decades earlier finally became the landscape everyone could see. Every forgotten field, abandoned barn, or overgrown hillside has a story waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. If this story reminded you that the greatest opportunities are often hidden beneath what others have given up on, let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment from Claire's journey? Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on The Last Acre, where every acre has a story, every field holds a lesson, and every forgotten path is worth exploring. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next story.